I was 10 years old when my parents drove me to a brick building in downtown Portland and signed papers giving me away. Not because I was troubled, not because they couldn't afford me, but because I was their daughter, and they had finally gotten the son they always wanted. My father shook hands with the social worker like he was closing a business deal. My mother hugged me once, whispered that I would understand when I was older, then walked away without looking back. I stood there clutching a suitcase and a framed Christmas photo, the only proof I ever belonged. 20 years later, that same father showed up at my door with a lawyer and a smile, not to apologize, but to claim half of the $27 million I had just inherited. He had no idea who I had become, or what I was about to do. I grew up in a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon, where fathers measured their worth by the sons who would carry their names forward. My father, Nathaniel Ward, was a bank manager who believed in order, control, and legacy. My mother, Marjorie, kept the house spotless and never questioned him. Not once. My two older brothers were his pride. Thomas, the eldest, brought home straight A's and captain positions on every team he joined. Andrew, 3 years older than me, collected soccer trophies like they were currency. Every Sunday dinner, my father would raise his glass and toast their achievements while my mother beamed. I sat at that same table with report cards just as perfect, with science fair ribbons pinned to my bedroom wall, and received nothing but a brief nod before the conversation shifted back to the boys. I tried everything. I studied until my eyes burned. I ran faster than Andrew in our backyard races. I even begged for a toy truck one Christmas instead of the dolls my mother kept buying, thinking maybe, just maybe, my father would finally see me. He never did. My mother's solution was to teach me how to be useful to someone else someday. She showed me how to fold fitted sheets into perfect squares, how to roast a chicken until the skin turned golden, how to set a table for guests who mattered. These skills will make you valuable one day, she told me, her hands guiding mine as we kneaded bread dough. She meant valuable to a husband, valuable to anyone but them. When my mother became pregnant again, my father declared with absolute certainty that this baby would be a boy. He painted the nursery blue before she even started showing. He bought tiny baseball gloves and framed a jersey with the name Ward stitched across the back. And when Daniel was born, my father's face lit up in a way I had never seen. He passed out cigars at the bank. He took a week off work just to hold his son. He called Daniel the future of the family, and I understood, even at 10 years old, that I had become unnecessary. The morning they told me, the sky over Portland was heavy with rain. My father sat at the head of the breakfast table, cleared his throat, and announced that I would soon be living with a better family. His voice was calm, businesslike, as if he were approving a loan application. My mother sat beside him, staring at her plate, twisting the hem of her apron between her fingers. I thought it was a punishment at first. I apologized for things I couldn't even name, for being too loud, too quiet, too much of a girl. But their faces never changed. My father gave me until that afternoon to pack one suitcase. Only what's essential, he said. I walked upstairs in a daze and stood in my pale pink bedroom, staring at the closet. What was essential when your own parents didn't want you? I folded 2 changes of clothes, tucked in the books I had read until their spines cracked, and placed my worn stuffed rabbit in the corner. On top, I laid a framed photo from last Christmas, the 5 of us smiling in front of the tree. I needed proof that once, even briefly, I had belonged. That afternoon, they drove me downtown. My father parked outside a squat brick building with a faded sign that read, Family Services. A woman with a clipboard met us at the door. My father filled out forms, handed over my suitcase, and shook her hand. My mother hugged me once, lightly, and whispered, You'll understand when you're older. Then they turned and walked to the car. They never looked back. That night, I lay on a narrow cot in a group home that smelled of bleach and old linoleum, clutching that Christmas photo against my chest. And I made myself a promise. I would never beg anyone to love me again, and I would never forget what I was worth to the people who were supposed to love me most. The group home was only the beginning. Within 3 weeks, I was placed with my first foster family in a crowded house on Portland's east side. 6 other kids already lived there, crammed into rooms with peeling wallpaper and bunk beds that creaked every time someone moved. The older kids bullied the younger ones. The foster parents ran the place like a business, not a home. Meals were served in shifts. Bedtime was enforced with shouting. I learned quickly to keep my head down, to finish my food without complaint, and to become invisible. When that placement collapsed under the weight of too many children and too little care, I was moved again, this time to a childless couple in their 40s who lived in a tidy ranch house in Beaverton. They called me sweetheart and bought me new shoes. For the first few weeks, I thought maybe this was what family was supposed to feel like. Warm dinners around a table, questions about my day at school, a softness I hadn't known existed. But by the second month, their patience wore thin. They had wanted a younger child, someone small enough to mold into the baby they never had. At 10, I was already too formed, too quiet, too damaged. One morning, I woke up to find my suitcase waiting by the door. They drove me back to the agency without explanation. The next home was in the suburbs again, a place with manicured lawns and locked kitchen cabinets. The parents were punctual with rules and allowances, but their smiles never reached their eyes. I realized quickly that I was a line item in their budget. Every child they took in meant another monthly stipend check. We were investments, not children. I stopped expecting warmth. I stopped expecting anything. My strategy became survival through erasure. I folded into corners of classrooms. I filled notebooks with neat handwriting and perfect assignments. I never asked for seconds at dinner. I never asked for anything. Teachers praised me for being studious and well-behaved, but none of them saw that my silence wasn't discipline. It was defense. The only person who seemed to notice was Elena Torres, my social worker. She arrived every month with a clipboard and sharp brown eyes that missed very little. One afternoon, she sat across from me in a fluorescent-lit office at the agency and leaned forward. "You're bright, Celine," she said, "but you're hiding behind those grades." I didn't answer. I didn't know how. But part of me wondered what she saw that no one else did. A few weeks later, Elena mentioned a name I hadn't heard before. James Calder. She said he was different. She said he had space in his home and patience in his heart. She said he wanted to meet me. I nodded, but I didn't believe her. I had heard promises before. A week later, I sat stiffly in the back of Elena's car as we turned down a tree-lined drive just outside Portland. The road ended in front of a beautiful craftsman-style home with wide eaves, a deep front porch, and flower beds that someone clearly tended with care. James Calder was already waiting, leaning against the porch railing with his hands in his pockets. He was tall and lean, maybe 60, with silver hair swept back and pale blue eyes that met mine without forcing a smile. Instead, he said, "You must be Celine. I've been hoping to meet you." He didn't ask me to perform. He didn't run through a list of house rules or expectations. He simply walked me through the rooms. Wooden floors polished to a soft glow. Shelves lined with books that looked red, not decorative. The smell of something herbal simmering on the stove. When he opened the door to a bedroom with large windows and an empty bookshelf, he paused. "I haven't painted yet," he said quietly. "I thought you might want to choose the colors yourself." No one had ever asked me that before. In the weeks that followed, I tested him with silence. He answered with presence. When nightmares woke me in the middle of the night, I found him sitting outside my door with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, waiting without questions. When I struggled with math homework, he pulled up a chair and sat beside me until the problems finally made sense. On a Saturday morning, I found him in the garage measuring planks of wood. "A bookshelf," he explained. "I figured your books deserved a proper home." It was the small things that began to crack open. The walls I had built, the way he put my school drawings on the refrigerator with magnets, not tape, the way he never rushed my words when I finally dared to speak them, the way he said good morning like he genuinely meant it. At 11 years old, I learned what steadiness looked like. 6 months later, the court finalized the adoption. Elena smiled as the judge declared my new legal name, Celine Calder. I held the papers in my hands, but it was James's quiet nod across the courtroom that made it real. For the first time in my life, permanence felt possible. James had a way of opening the world to me without making it feel like a lesson. One Saturday, he drove us into the West Hills, and we walked through the grand halls of Pittock Mansion, a historic estate overlooking the city. He pointed out the lines of the staircases, the balance of the windows, the way light seemed to follow us from room to room. "Architecture isn't just about walls," he told me. "It's about shaping how people feel inside a space." Another weekend, he took me downtown to Keller Fountain Park, where water cascaded over massive concrete steps in a way that felt both wild and controlled. I started sketching in notebooks, not just houses, but entire neighborhoods. ways to make spaces warmer, safer, more alive. James bought me pencils and graph paper without asking if I was serious. He simply believed I was. High school tested me in different ways. I still carried the instinct to disappear, but slowly I learned to stand my ground. Zoe Ramirez barged into my life in 10th grade, sliding into the library seat next to me and announcing we were partners for a history project. She was confident, loud, impossible to ignore. And somehow, she decided I was worth knowing. Against every instinct I had, I let her stay. Therapy helped too. Dr. Alice Monroe's office was filled with soft chairs and bookshelves, a space where silence wasn't punished. She guided me back through the years I tried to bury, reminding me that my parents' rejection said everything about their limits, not mine. Slowly, I started to believe her. By senior year, the impossible happened. A letter arrived from Cornell University's architecture program. Acceptance, printed in bold letters. James framed it and hung it in the living room, telling anyone who visited that his daughter was headed to New York. For the first time, the word future didn't frighten me. By my early 30s, I had built a career I was proud of. My designs were no longer just sketches in notebooks, but real structures standing across Portland. Community centers with walls of glass and courtyards where neighbors actually gathered. Affordable housing projects that didn't look like afterthoughts. Awards came, articles in the Oregonian, invitations to speak at architecture conferences in Seattle and San Francisco. But every achievement felt incomplete unless I could share it with James. He remained my anchor, sitting in the front row at every opening, his pride quiet but unmistakable. It was during one of those celebrations that I noticed the change. He clapped, but his hands trembled slightly. Later at dinner, he pushed food around his plate, his appetite gone. When I asked, he brushed it off with a joke about getting old, but I knew something was wrong. Weeks later, the truth arrived like a crack of thunder. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. The oncologist spoke in careful, measured tones about treatment options and timelines, but the message was clear. There was no fixing this. James sat beside me in that sterile office, and when the doctor left, he took my hand. "We can't choose the length of the road," he said softly. "Only how we walk it." He refused the aggressive treatments that would steal what little time he had left. Instead, he chose to stay home, and I chose to be his caretaker. I put my projects on hold. I moved back into the house that had saved me. Our days became measured and precious. Mornings were medication schedules and tea in the sunroom, watching light filter through the trees. Afternoons, we revisited old photo albums, his stories weaving the past into something I could carry forward. He told me about his late wife, about the daughter they had lost to illness when she was only 6, about how fostering me had given him a second chance at fatherhood. In the evenings, when the pain pressed hardest, I sat beside him and read aloud from the books we both loved, my voice filling the silence that once frightened me as a child. Even as his body weakened, his mind stayed sharp. He asked about my projects, urged me to keep building, reminded me that my work mattered more than I realized. On a quiet October night, rain tapping against the windows, he took my hand. His voice was barely a whisper, but the words carved themselves into my heart. "Build something that outlives us both." I stayed with him until the very end, holding his hand as his breathing slowed, telling him he had given me more than any blueprint ever could. When the silence finally came, it felt like the world had shifted on its axis. The grief was enormous, but beneath it was something else. A steady pulse of resolve, a promise I would have to keep. The weeks after James's death blurred together in a haze of condolences, funeral arrangements, and paperwork. When his lawyer called me to the office, I expected the basics. The house, maybe some savings, a few personal belongings. What I did not expect was the number written in black ink across the will. $27 million. James had left me everything. His home, his investments, the business he had sold years before. I stared at that figure, unable to reconcile it with the man who wore flannel shirts and old gardening gloves, who spent his weekends building bookshelves and tending roses. He had never lived like someone with wealth. His joy had come from books, quiet dinners, and my company. To learn he had carried this fortune all along made me realize how much he had sacrificed in silence, how carefully he had protected and invested, all so he could leave me secure. News traveled fast. Within days, the local papers ran the story. Portland architect inherits multi-million-dollar estate. My photo, pulled from some company website, appeared beside headlines I never asked for. Colleagues offered congratulations that sounded awkward and stilted. Strangers at coffee shops recognized me. Acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly reached out with investment opportunities and business proposals. At night, I lay awake in the house that now felt heavier without James's presence. The money didn't soften the loss, it sharpened it. The fortune felt less like a gift and more like a responsibility, a weight pressing me to prove I was worthy of what he had built. I walked through his study one evening, running my fingers along the spines of books we had read together, and I understood. He hadn't left me money to spend. He had left me the means to keep building, to honor the promise I made at his bedside. It was then that the doorbell rang, cutting sharply through the silence, pulling me toward a confrontation I never saw coming. 3 months after the headlines, I was beginning to find my footing again. I split my time between work and sorting through James's belongings, keeping the pieces that still carried his presence. One rainy afternoon, the doorbell rang. Through the glass, I saw a man in his 60s, well-dressed but worn at the edges. When I opened the door, he spoke a name I hadn't heard in over 2 decades. "It's me, Celine, your father, Nathaniel Ward." The air left my lungs. He looked smaller than the giant I remembered, his frame slouched, his face deeply lined. But the arrogance was still there in the way he tried to step past me into the house. Behind him stood a younger man in a suit, briefcase in hand. Nathaniel offered a rehearsed smile. "I've been looking for you for years," he said. "When I read about your inheritance, I knew it was time to make things right. I didn't invite them in. I let him talk on the porch, his words tumbling out about regrets and mistakes, about how families should forgive. The lawyer cleared his throat and spoke carefully about reconciliation and shared legacy. My hands tightened on the door frame. This wasn't remorse. This was strategy. That night, I hired a private investigator. If Nathaniel had reappeared after decades of silence, I wanted the truth. A week later, the report landed on my desk. Gambling debts piled high across 3 states. Foreclosure on his last house. Jobs abandoned. Bridges burned. My brothers, the sons he had once prized above everything, were both estranged. Thomas hadn't spoken to him in 5 years after endless demands for money. Andrew had cut ties after college and never looked back. The picture was complete. This man wasn't returning to mend anything. He was circling the scent of money. We met in a conference room at my lawyer's office downtown. Nathaniel arrived late, swaggering as if the delay proved his importance. He leaned back in his chair, confidence radiating from every gesture. "You've done well for yourself," he began. "But blood counts for something. That fortune is part of my legacy, whether you admit it or not." I let him finish. Then I slid the investigator's report across the polished table. Pages of debts, foreclosures, and failed schemes lay exposed between us. "You forfeited any claim to me the day you signed those papers at Family Services," I said evenly. "You never looked for me until money was involved. I owe you nothing." His smile faltered. For the first time, I saw the desperation behind the performance. "So that's it?" he said, voice rising. "You're going to turn your back on your own father?" "I'll offer one thing," I replied. "Rehab funding. Nothing more. If you want a future, it won't come through me. It will come through getting help." He said nothing more. As I stood to leave, I felt a strange lightness, the kind that comes from closing a door that should never have been opened. Days later, an email arrived from Jason, my middle brother. He had seen the news and recognized my name. His words were hesitant but sincere, apologizing for his silence when we were children, for not protecting me when he should have. We met for coffee in a quiet shop in the Pearl District. The conversation was careful, tentative, but real. It was a beginning. The idea came slowly, like something taking root. The Calder Foundation for Family Futures. I used James's fortune to build what I had once needed. 20 units of affordable housing for young adults aging out of foster care, with a community center downstairs and counseling services on site. The day of the ribbon cutting, I stood at the podium with the press gathered and spoke from the heart. "Family is not blood," I said, my voice steady. "It is choice, commitment, and love. When we choose each other, we build something stronger than inheritance. We build a future. As the ribbon fell and applause rose, I reached for the silver key pendant James had given me years before. It warmed in my hand, no longer just a symbol of the home he opened for me, but of the doors now opening for others. When fortune and freedom finally land in your hands, the question isn't what you inherit. It's what you choose to build and for whom. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more stories about resilience, family, and second chances.